Olympic National Park, Washington, October 17, 2024, 6:47 a.m. Marcus Hayes had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 20 years, but the morning mist rolling through the Hoh rainforest still made him pause in reverence. The ancient Sitka spruces and western hemlocks disappeared into the fog above, their moss-draped branches creating a natural cathedral that had stood for centuries. At 45, his knees complained more than they used to during the steep climbs, but Marcus wouldn't trade this job for anything. The forest was home, more so than the small apartment in Forks where he spent his nights. He adjusted his pack and continued along the Hoh River Trail, the routine morning patrol he'd done hundreds of times. The Roosevelt elk would be grazing in the meadows soon, and he wanted to check the new mineral lick the wildlife management team had established last month. His boots squelched in the perpetually damp earth, a rhythmic sound that matched his breathing. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "Marcus, you there? This is dispatch." He unclipped it, never breaking stride. "Go ahead, Janet. We've got a situation. Professor from the University of Washington called in about 30 minutes ago. Says his colleague hasn't returned from a research trip in your sector. Been gone 2 days now." Marcus frowned. October wasn't the ideal time for solo research trips. The weather could turn without warning, and hypothermia was a real risk for the unprepared. "Got a name and last known?" Professor Harold Whitman, anthropologist, 65 years old. He was studying Native American sites near the Upper Hoh. His colleague says Whitman was specifically looking for petroglyphs in the caves above mile marker 12. Marcus knew the area well. The caves were off-trail, technically restricted without special research permits, but academics often bent the rules when they got excited about their work. The Hoh River tribe had inhabited these forests for thousands of years, and their artifacts were scattered throughout the park, most undocumented and protected by federal law. "I'll head that way," Marcus said. "Send his description and vehicle info to my phone. Has search and rescue been notified?" "Not yet. Wanted to check with you first since you know those caves better than anyone. Give me 4 hours. If I don't find signs of him by then, we'll call in the team." Marcus picked up his pace. The caves were a good 3-hour hike from his current position, longer if he had to bushwhack through the understory. The forest grew denser as he moved deeper into the park. The tourist trails were far behind now, and he was in the true wilderness where 1,000-year-old trees created a canopy so thick that noon looked like twilight below. The only sounds were the distant rush of the Hoh River and the occasional call of a Steller's jay. Even after 2 decades, Marcus never took for granted how quickly the rainforest could swallow you whole. One wrong turn off the trail, and you might never be found. As he hiked, he reviewed what he knew about Professor Whitman from the information Janet had sent. The man was a respected anthropologist specializing in Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures. He'd published several papers on the Hoh River tribe and had been coming to the park for research for over a decade. Not a novice then, which made his disappearance more concerning. Experienced researchers didn't just get lost. The morning progressed and the mist began to burn off, replaced by shafts of sunlight that pierced the canopy like golden spears. Marcus reached mile marker 12 by 10 a.m. and began looking for the game trail that led to the caves. He found it quickly. He'd been here many times over the years, both for his own exploration and to escort researchers. But something was off. The trail showed signs of recent use, multiple sets of footprints in the mud. But they were strange. Some were clearly from hiking boots, probably Whitman's, heading toward the caves. But there were others, smaller prints, bare feet from the look of them. Children's feet, maybe half a dozen different sets, all heading in the same direction. Marcus knelt beside the prints, his expert eye reading the story in the mud. The boot prints were 2 days old, matching Whitman's timeline. But the barefoot prints were fresher, maybe 12 hours. Who would bring children out here barefoot? The nearest authorized camping area was 15 miles away, and no permits had been issued for youth groups in this sector. He followed the trail up the steep incline toward the caves, his hand unconsciously checking the bear spray on his belt. The forest grew quieter as he climbed, the usual bird chatter diminishing until only the sound of his own breathing filled his ears. That wasn't right. The forest was never completely silent unless something had spooked the wildlife. The cave entrance appeared through the trees, a dark mouth in the hillside partially hidden by a curtain of moss and ferns. Marcus had explored it years ago. It went back about 200 feet into the mountain with several chambers connected by narrow passages. The Ho River tribe had used it for ceremonies centuries ago, and the walls bore faint petroglyphs that the Park Service kept off official maps to prevent vandalism. "Professor Whitman?" Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the rocks. "This is Ranger Hayes with the Park Service. Are you in there?" No response. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and entered the cave, the temperature dropping immediately. The familiar musty smell of bat guano and damp stone filled his nostrils. Whitman's boot prints continued into the darkness, still accompanied by the strange barefoot tracks. On the cave walls, his light revealed something that made him stop cold. New drawings covered the ancient petroglyphs. They were crude, childlike, drawn with what looked like charcoal or mud. Stick figures with too many limbs, animals with human faces, and recurring symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was the freshness that disturbed Marcus most. Some of the drawings were still wet. He moved deeper into the cave, calling Whitman's name every few yards. In the second chamber, he found the professor's equipment, a backpack, camera, notebooks, all arranged neatly against the wall as if Whitman had just stepped away. Marcus examined the notebooks, finding detailed sketches of the original petroglyphs and extensive notes in cramped handwriting. The last entry was from 2 days ago. Incredible discovery. The petroglyphs here are older than anything previously documented. They tell of something the tribe called the first children, beings that existed in the forest before humans arrived. The tribe believed they still lived in the deep woods, ageless, waiting. There's a warning repeated several times. Do not listen to their songs, do not follow their lights, do not look at their faces. I must document this before. The entry ended mid-sentence. Marcus swept his light around the chamber and noticed a narrow passage he'd never explored before, partially hidden behind a fallen rock. The barefoot prints led directly to it, and there were drag marks in the dirt. Something heavy had been pulled through. He squeezed through the opening, his broad shoulders scraping against the stone. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and the smell hit him immediately. Decay, sweet and cloying, mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. His light revealed Professor Whitman slumped against the far wall. Marcus rushed to him, checking for a pulse. Weak, but present. The man was alive but unconscious, his skin pale and clammy. "Professor Whitman, can you hear me?" Marcus gently shook the older man's shoulder. Whitman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild. "The children," he whispered, his voice barely audible. They're not children. They're so old, older than the trees. They sing, oh God, they sing such beautiful songs." "It's okay, Professor. I'm going to get you out of here." Marcus reached for his radio to call for backup, but Whitman grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "They're still here," Whitman said, his eyes focusing on something behind Marcus. "They never left. They're watching us right now." Marcus turned his flashlight behind him, and his blood went cold. Dozens of small handprints covered the walls of the chamber, pressed into what looked like a mixture of mud and something darker. But these weren't normal handprints. Each had too many fingers, joints that bent in impossible directions. And in the center of each print was a small mouth, filled with tiny, perfect human teeth. A sound drifted through the passage, singing. Children's voices, high and sweet, singing a lullaby in a language Marcus didn't recognize. But underneath the innocent sound was something else, a resonance that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. "We need to leave. Now." Marcus hauled Whitman to his feet, supporting most of the older man's weight. They squeezed back through the passage, the singing growing louder behind them. As they entered the main chamber, Marcus's light caught movement near the cave entrance. Children stood there blocking their exit, 6 of them, maybe 7 or 8 years old in appearance, completely naked despite the cold. Their skin was pale as mushrooms, their hair long and tangled with moss and twigs. They stood perfectly still, holding hands, their mouths open in song. But their eyes were ancient, black from edge to edge, reflecting his flashlight like an animal's. Marcus took a step forward, and the children tilted their heads in perfect unison, the gesture so coordinated it looked rehearsed. One of them, a girl with hair so long it pooled around her feet, stepped forward. When she smiled, Marcus saw her teeth were filed to points. "Play with us," she said, her voice layered somehow, as if multiple people were speaking through her small mouth. "The forest is lonely. We've been alone for so long. We're leaving," Marcus said firmly, though his hand shook as he reached for his bear spray. "Step aside." The children laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "The old one played with us," the girl said, gesturing to Whitman. "He learned our songs, saw our true faces, now he's one of us. And you will be too." Whitman began to hum, the same melody the children were singing. His eyes had gone completely black, and when Marcus looked at him in horror, the professor smiled with too many teeth. Marcus made a decision. He triggered the bear spray, filling the cave entrance with capsaicin cloud. The children scattered, their song turning to inhuman shrieks that no child's throat should be able to make. He dragged Whitman through the cloud, his own eyes burning and streaming tears. Outside, the forest was silent and still. No birds, no insects. Even the ever-present sound of the river seemed muted. Marcus half-carried, half-dragged Whitman down the trail, his radio crackling with static every time he tried to call for help. Behind them, the singing started again, following them through the trees. "They're coming." Whitman laughed, his voice changing, becoming younger somehow. "They want to play. They've been alone for so long, forgotten by everyone except the trees. The tribe knew. They tried to warn us, but we didn't listen." Marcus pushed harder, his legs burning with effort. The trail seemed longer than before, twisting in directions he didn't remember. The trees pressed closer, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. And always, the singing followed them. Then he saw them. The children were in the trees, moving through the canopy with impossible agility. They swung from branch to branch, their long hair streaming behind them like smoke. One dropped down directly in front of them, landing in a crouch that should have broken bones. When it stood, Marcus saw its joints bent backward at the knees and elbows, allowing it to move in ways that violated human anatomy. "Please," it said in that horrible layered voice. "We're so hungry. We've been eating moss and beetles for decades. The old one promised us meat if we taught him our songs." That's when Marcus noticed the bones scattered in the underbrush. Small animals mostly, but some larger. Some that looked disturbingly human-shaped. His hand went to his service weapon, though he knew it would be useless. Whatever these things were, they weren't really children. A memory surfaced from his training, something the tribal liaison had mentioned years ago about the old stories. The first children, the forgotten ones. The spirits that wore the faces of innocence but were older than memory. They fed on the lost, the lonely, those who strayed too far from the path, and once you heard their song, really heard it, you belonged to them forever. The singing grew louder, more complex, harmonies that shouldn't exist weaving through the air. Marcus felt his mind starting to fray at the edges, the urge to stop running, to turn and look at their true faces, to join their eternal play growing stronger with each note. But then, through the supernatural chorus, he heard something else. A helicopter. Search and rescue had come looking when he hadn't checked in. He fired his flare gun straight up, the red light punching through the canopy. The children's song turned to screams of rage. "You can't leave!" they shrieked in unison. "No one leaves! The forest keeps everyone!" They descended from the trees, no longer maintaining their human facade. Their limbs stretched and contorted, fingers becoming claws, mouths opening too wide, revealing rows of teeth like a shark's. Marcus didn't look back, just ran toward the sound of the helicopter, dragging Whitman, who was now laughing and crying simultaneously. They burst out of the tree line into a meadow where the rescue helicopter was landing. The search and rescue team rushed toward them, but Marcus could see their confusion as they looked past him at the forest edge. The children stood there just inside the shadows of the trees, looking like normal kids again. One of them waved sweetly at the rescue team. "Don't look at them." Marcus shouted, but it was too late. One of the younger SAR members, Tommy Chen, took a step toward the forest. "Are those kids okay?" Tommy asked, his voice dreamy. "They look lost. We should help them." Marcus tackled Tommy before he could take another step, both men hitting the ground hard. "Get us in the air now," he screamed at the pilot. "Don't look at the forest, don't listen to anything you hear." The team, trained to follow emergency protocols without question, loaded them into the helicopter. As they lifted off, Marcus looked down to see the children emerging from the forest, their heads tilted up to watch them leave. Even from height, he could see them singing, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization. Whitman was sedated and flown to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. The official report stated he'd suffered from severe hypothermia and dehydration leading to hallucinations. Marcus filed his own report, but it was classified and buried in the Park Service archives. The caves were sealed with concrete barriers, and the area was designated as permanently restricted, off limits even to researchers. But Marcus knew it wouldn't matter. 3 weeks later, he was doing paperwork in the ranger station when the call came in. Professor Whitman had walked out of the hospital in the middle of the night, leaving only a note. "The children are calling. They taught me such beautiful songs." His body was never found. Marcus tried to return to his normal routine, but the forest felt different now. He could feel them watching from the deep woods, waiting. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist was thick, he swore he could hear singing carried on the wind. Children's voices, sweet and innocent, calling him to come play. The other rangers noticed his change. He refused any assignments near the Ho River's upper reaches, wouldn't patrol alone anymore, and had developed a habit of constantly checking behind him on trails. They thought he was having some kind of breakdown, maybe PTSD from the Whitman rescue. 6 months passed. Marcus was considering early retirement, maybe moving somewhere with no forests at all. Arizona maybe, or Nevada. Somewhere the trees couldn't watch him. He was packing up his apartment in Forks when he heard it. Children singing outside his window. That same horrible, beautiful melody that had followed him out of the cave. He looked out the window. The street was empty except for a lone child standing under the streetlight, a girl with long dark hair wearing a tattered dress. She looked up at his window and smiled, revealing those filed teeth. She held something in her hands, one of his ranger badges, the spare he kept in his truck. How had she gotten it? "We miss you, Ranger Marcus," she called up to him, her layered voice carrying impossible distances. "The professor is happy with us now. He plays such fun games. Won't you come play too? The forest is lonely without you." Marcus backed away from the window, reaching for his phone to call. Who? The police? The Park Service? Who would believe him? When he looked again, the girl was gone, but the singing continued, now coming from multiple directions. They were surrounding his building. He grabbed his emergency bag and ran for his truck, but they were waiting in the parking lot. A dozen of them now, all holding hands in a circle around his vehicle, singing that damned song. Up close, he could see details he'd missed in the cave. Their skin had a subtle bark-like texture. Their hair was actually some kind of moss or lichen, and their bare feet had too many toes, spreading like roots where they touched the ground. "You can't run from the forest," they said in unison. "It's inside you now. Every time you close your eyes, you see the trees. Every time you sleep, you dream of the deep woods. You belong with us." They were right. The dreams had started the night after the rescue. Dreams of running through the forest on all fours, of climbing trees with impossible ease, of hunting things in the dark while singing ancient songs. Dreams that felt more real than his waking life. "What are you?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. The children tilted their heads, considering. "We were here first," they finally answered. "Before your kind, before the tribes, before names and words. We are what the forest dreams, what grows in the spaces between the trees. We are the ones who remember when the world was young and wild and honest. And now we're lonely," the girl added, stepping forward. "So few believe in us anymore. So few can see us for what we truly are. But you can, Ranger Marcus. You've always known the forest was alive, haven't you? You've felt us watching all these years." Marcus wanted to deny it, but couldn't. He had felt it. That sensation of being observed during solo patrols. The certainty that the forest had a consciousness of its own. The way certain groves felt hostile or welcoming, independent of any logical reason. The professor understood. The children continued. He studied the old warnings, learned our true nature, and still chose to join us. He's happy now, free from the prison of aging flesh, part of something eternal. You could be too. "You're killers," Marcus said, remembering the bones in the forest. "You hunt people." They laughed, that wind chime sound that made his teeth hurt. "Everything hunts, Ranger Marcus. The eagle takes the salmon, the wolf takes the elk, the forest takes everything in the end. We only take the lost, the lonely, those who hear our song and choose to follow. We never force anyone." The professor came willingly, once he understood what we offered. "And what's that?" "Forever," they said simply. "To be part of the forest forever, never aging, never dying, never alone. To run through the trees for eternity, to sing the old songs, to remember what the world was before humanity caged it with roads and cities and rules." Marcus felt the pull of it, stronger than before. Part of him, the part that had spent 20 years in the wilderness, that felt more at home among the trees than among people, wanted to say yes, to shed his human skin and become something wild and free and terrible. But another part, the part that had sworn an oath to protect the park and its visitors, resisted. "No," he said firmly. "I won't let you take anyone else." The children's expressions didn't change, but the air grew colder. "You can't stop us, Ranger Marcus. We've existed since before your species learned to speak. We'll exist long after you're gone. The forest is patient. It can wait." They began walking backward, still holding hands, still singing. One by one, they faded into the darkness between the streetlights until only the girl remained. "We'll be waiting," she said softly. "In every shadow between the trees, in every cave you'll never explore, in every trail that leads deeper than maps show. And one day, when you're old and tired and alone, you'll remember our song and come looking for us. They always do." She turned and walked away, her bare feet making no sound on the pavement. The singing faded with her, leaving Marcus standing alone in the parking lot, shaking despite his heavy coat. He got in his truck and drove through the night, not stopping until he reached Seattle. He turned in his resignation the next day, citing health concerns. The Park Service didn't argue. They'd seen his reports, noticed his behavior changes. They gave him a full pension and a commendation for his years of service. Marcus moved to Phoenix, about as far from the Pacific Northwest forests as he could get while staying in the country. He got a job as a security consultant, lived in a concrete apartment complex, and tried to forget. But the dreams never stopped. Every night he ran through the Hoh rainforest on limbs that weren't quite human anymore, singing songs in a language that predated words. 2 years later, he saw the news report. 3 hikers had gone missing in Olympic National Park, last seen heading toward the restricted area near the upper Hoh River. The search teams found their equipment neatly arranged in a cave, but no bodies. The Park Service increased the restriction zone and posted new warnings, but Marcus knew it wouldn't help. The children were getting hungrier and lonelier. That night, the dreams were different. He saw Professor Whitman, but changed. His body was elongated, his fingers stretched into twigs, his hair replaced by moss. He moved through the canopy with the same impossible grace as the children, and when he smiled, his mouth opened too wide. "It's not so bad, Marcus," Whitman said in the dream, his voice layered like theirs now. "I understand everything now. The petroglyphs were warnings, yes, but also invitations. The tribe knew what the children were, and some chose to join them. They became the spirits of the forest, the guardians of the wild places. That's all we are, the part of humanity that chose the trees over civilization." "You're not human anymore," Marcus said. "No," Whitman agreed. "I'm something better. Something that will outlive cities and nations and the very memory of what humanity was. When the last human dies, We'll still be here, singing in the forests, keeping the old ways alive. Marcus woke gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat. He could still hear the singing, faint but persistent, carried on a wind that shouldn't exist in his climate-controlled apartment. He went to the window and looked out at the Phoenix skyline, all concrete and glass and electric light. But in the reflection, he saw trees. The forest, somehow, was looking back. He lasted another year before the isolation broke him. He'd tried dating, making friends, building a life in the desert, but nothing felt real anymore. Every conversation was hollow compared to the layered voices of the children. Every human connection felt temporary compared to what they offered. He was 68 now, his body beginning to fail, his knees shot from decades of hiking. The doctor said he'd need replacement surgery soon, would probably be in a wheelchair within 5 years. That's when the letter arrived. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in a child's unsteady hand. Inside was a single photograph, the Hoh rainforest in morning mist, the trees impossibly tall and green. And at the bottom, written in what looked like mud, "We're still waiting." Marcus stared at the photo for hours. He could smell the forest through the paper somehow, petrichor and moss, cedar and fern. He could hear the river rushing over stones worn smooth by centuries. He could feel the soft earth under his feet, see the filtered sunlight through the canopy. He bought a plane ticket that night. The Olympic Peninsula hadn't changed much in 3 years. Forks was still a sleepy logging town trading on twilight tourism. The park entrance still had the same weather-worn welcome sign. But Marcus felt different returning to it, like a salmon finally reaching its spawning ground. He didn't check in at the ranger station, didn't file a hiking permit. He just parked at the trailhead and walked into the forest as the sun set. His knees didn't hurt anymore, adrenaline maybe, or something else. The trail felt familiar under his feet, every root and stone exactly where he remembered. He hiked through the night, not needing a flashlight. The moon was full, and besides, he knew the way. The forest was silent except for his footsteps, as if every living thing was holding its breath. When he reached mile marker 12, the game trail was waiting, cleared of 3 years' growth as if someone had been maintaining it. The concrete barriers over the cave entrance had been shattered from the inside, chunks of rebar-reinforced concrete scattered like toys. The cave mouth yawned black and welcoming. Marcus didn't hesitate. He walked in. They were waiting in the first chamber, all of them, not just the children, but others too. He recognized some faces from missing person reports over the years, hikers and researchers who'd vanished without a trace. They stood in a circle holding hands, their bodies in various stages of transformation. Some, like Whitman, were almost completely changed, their humanity just a memory held in the shape of their faces. Others were newer, still struggling against the metamorphosis. The girl stepped forward, unchanged from 3 years ago. Of course she was unchanged. She'd probably looked exactly the same for centuries. "Welcome home, Ranger Marcus," she said, and for the first time her voice held warmth. "We knew you'd come. They always come back, the ones who truly hear the song." "What happens now?" Marcus asked, though part of him already knew. "Now you choose," she said. "Stay human, age, die, become nothing but memory and dust. Or join us, become part of the eternal forest, sing the old songs forever. The transformation isn't pleasant, but pain is temporary. What we offer is forever." Marcus looked around the cave, at the faces of the transformed. Some looked peaceful, others terrified, but all were singing now, that haunting melody that had haunted him for 3 years. He thought about his empty apartment in Phoenix, his failing body, his isolated existence. Then he thought about 20 years of walking these trails, of feeling truly alive only when surrounded by trees. "Will I remember?" he asked. "Will I still be me?" The girl tilted her head, considering. "You'll remember everything, but it won't matter anymore. Human concerns, bills, politics, mortality, they'll seem like dreams you once had. You'll be part of something larger, older, truer than anything humanity has built." Marcus thought about all the people who would disappear after him, drawn by the children's song. He thought about his duty to protect them, But then Whitman spoke, his voice barely recognizable but still carrying a trace of his professorial tone. "I studied them for decades without understanding," Whitman said. "They're not evil, Marcus. They're just other. They're what we might have become if we'd chosen differently at the dawn of civilization. They're the path not taken, and they're lonely for their own kind." "We don't take anyone who doesn't want to come," the children added in unison. "We sing, and those who hear the true song, who understand what we offer, they choose. The forest doesn't force, it invites." Marcus felt the last of his resistance crumble. He'd made his choice 3 years ago, really, when he'd first heard their song. Everything since had just been delaying the inevitable. "Show me," he said. The children smiled, their filed teeth gleaming in the darkness. They began to sing, but this time Marcus didn't resist. He let the melody fill him, let it reshape him from the inside out. The transformation started in his bones, a deep ache that became agony and then transcended pain entirely. He felt his skeleton elongating, joints reversing, fingers stretching. His skin hardened, taking on the texture of bark. His hair fell out, replaced by soft moss. The human part of his mind screamed, but it was distant, unimportant. The forest was filling him. Centuries of growth and decay, the endless cycle of life and death and rebirth. He saw the world through compound eyes now, could taste the chemical signals plants used to communicate, could hear the ultrasonic calls of bats and the infrasonic groans of trees swaying in wind. When it was over, he stood transformed. His ranger uniform hung in tatters on his changed body. He was taller now, thin as a sapling but strong as an old-growth cedar. His fingers had become twigs that could still manipulate objects but could also root into soil to draw nutrients. His feet were spreading roots that could grip bark or stone with equal ease. "How do you feel?" the girl asked, though she no longer looked like a girl to his new eyes. He could see her true form now, ancient, tree-like, a perfect fusion of plant and animal, something that had never been human but had worn that shape like a costume. "Free," Marcus answered, his voice layered like theirs now, harmonizing with itself. "I feel free." They taught him to hunt in the canopy, to move through the trees faster than any human could run on the ground. They showed him how to sing the old songs that could lure the lost and lonely, how to wear the shape of innocence when needed. They shared the memories of the forest, stretching back to the Ice Age and beyond. He learned he wasn't the first ranger to join them. There had been others over the decades, protectors of the forest who'd heard the deeper call of the wild. They formed a special caste among the children, using their knowledge of human systems to keep the deep woods protected, to ensure the restricted areas stayed restricted, to misdirect searches when necessary. The hunger was the hardest part to accept. Not a physical hunger, they could survive on moonlight and rain if needed, but a spiritual hunger for companionship, for others who could hear the song. It drove them to sing, to call, to wait at the edges of civilization for those rare souls who belonged with them. Marcus took his place among them, another voice in the eternal chorus. He learned to recognize the ones who would come, the hikers who lingered too long at viewpoints staring into the forest depths, the researchers who spent more time with trees than people, the children who wandered from campsites, following fireflies deeper into the woods. Not all who heard the song would come. Most would feel a chill, a moment of inexplicable dread, and hurry back to their safe, human world. But a few, maybe 1 or 2 a year, would stop and listen, would hear the promise in the melody, would choose the forest over the city, the eternal over the temporary. 5 years after his transformation, Marcus encountered another ranger on patrol. She was young, maybe 25, with the same wonder in her eyes that he'd once had. She was investigating reports of strange singing near the restricted area, had found tracks that didn't make sense. He watched her from the canopy, his changed body invisible among the moss and branches. She was methodical, careful, taking photos of the impossible footprints, making detailed notes. When she reached the shattered concrete barriers at the cave entrance, she hesitated. "Hello?" she called into the darkness. "Is someone in there?" Marcus wanted to warn her, to tell her to run, to never come back. But he also recognized something in her, that deep connection to the forest, that sense of belonging among the trees rather than in towns. She would hear the song truly. He knew she would understand what they offered. So he sang. Just a few notes, carried on the wind, barely audible. She froze, her head tilted, listening. He saw the moment the song reached her, really reached her. Her eyes widened, pupils dilating. She took a step toward the cave, then another. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "What is that?" The other children joined him, their voices weaving together into something that was more than music. It was the sound of wind through leaves, of rain on bark, of seeds sprouting in dark earth. It was every sunrise the forest had ever seen, every storm it had weathered, every secret it kept. The ranger, Sarah, her name tag said, walked into the cave as if in a trance. But Marcus could see she was fully aware, fully choosing. The song didn't compel, it revealed. It showed what life could be without the constraints of mortality, society, human limitation. They were waiting for her in the chamber, the whole family of the forest. Dozens now, all the lost and lonely who'd chosen the trees over time. Sarah looked at them, really looked, not flinching from their transformed states, and Marcus saw recognition in her eyes. "I've dreamed of you," she said softly. "Ever since I was a child. I've dreamed of running through the trees forever, of being part of something ancient and wild." "Dreams are just memories of what could be," the children replied. "You've always belonged here. You've always heard our song even when you couldn't name it." Sarah looked at her ranger uniform, her radio, her human life. Then she looked at the children, at the promise of eternity among the trees. Marcus knew what she would choose before she spoke. "Show me," she said, just as he had 5 years ago. The transformation was easier to watch the second time, knowing what beauty waited on the other side of the pain. Sarah screamed, then laughed, then sang as her body reshaped itself into something between human and tree, animal and plant. When it was over, she stood among them, bark-skinned and moss-haired, her eyes black as forest pools but shining with joy. "Welcome, sister," Marcus said, his branching fingers touching hers. "Welcome to forever." Together, they returned to the canopy, to the eternal dance through the trees. More would come. They always did. The lonely, the lost, the ones who heard the deeper songs of the wild. The forest would call and a few would answer, choosing the ancient over the modern, the eternal over the temporary. And in the restricted zones of Olympic National Park, where the trails ended and the maps lied, the children of the forest would wait. Patient as trees, old as stones, singing their beautiful, terrible songs. They would wait for the ones who belonged with them, the ones who understood that some prices were worth paying for forever. The Park Service would continue filing reports of missing hikers, would expand restricted areas, would post more warnings. But it wouldn't matter. The forest was patient. It had been there before humans carved out their civilizations, and it would be there after the last city crumbled to dust. And in the deepest groves, where sunlight never touched the ground, the children would play their eternal games, sing their timeless songs, and wait for the next lonely soul to hear their call. Because everyone belonged somewhere, and some belonged to the forest, forever. Olympic National Park, Washington. October 17th, 2024, 6:47 a.m. The morning mist clung to the ancient Douglas firs like a burial shroud, and Senior Ranger Emma Whitehorse knew something was wrong before her radio even crackled to life. She'd felt it in her bones since dawn, that peculiar heaviness in the air that her grandmother used to call the forest holding its breath. Emma had been checking the trail markers along the Sol Duc River when she noticed the absence of birdsong. In her 23 years with the Park Service, she'd learned to read the forest's moods like scripture. The stellar jays should have been screaming their morning territorialism by now. The Douglas squirrels should have been chattering. Instead, there was only the river's constant murmur and the soft drip of condensation from the moss-laden branches. Her radio hissed. "Base to Whitehorse, come in." "Whitehorse here," she responded, her breath misting in the October chill. "Emma, we need you at the Graves Creek turnout. Pete Wilson's truck has been there 3 days, his neighbors worried sick." Emma's stomach tightened. Old Pete knew these woods better than anyone alive. He'd been a ranger here for 35 years before retiring. If something had happened to him... "Copy that, 20 minutes out." She turned her truck around on the narrow forest road, tires crunching on the carpet of fallen needles. The fog grew thicker as she descended into the valley, reducing visibility to mere yards. The old-growth giants loomed out of the mist like primordial sentinels, their trunks wider than her truck. Some of these trees had been standing when her ancestors first walked these paths, long before European ships ever touched the Pacific shore. Pete's battered Ford pickup sat alone in the turnout, covered in a fine layer of moisture and fallen leaves. Emma parked beside it and climbed out, her boots squelching in the saturated earth. The driver's door was unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Pete's walking stick, a gnarled piece of oak he'd carved himself, leaned against the passenger seat. She keyed her radio. "Vehicle located. No sign of Wilson. Beginning trail search." "Copy that. Want us to send backup?" Emma studied the trailhead. Pete's boot prints were still visible in the mud, heading into the forest along the abandoned Graves Creek mining trail. That trail had been officially closed since the 1970s, after a series of disappearances that were never properly explained. Pete knew that history better than anyone. So why had he gone in there? "Not yet. Let me do an initial sweep. The old mining trail isn't on our regular patrol routes for a reason." "Be careful, Emma. That area gives everyone the creeps." She couldn't argue with that. Even her grandmother, who'd been born on the Maca Reservation 90 miles northwest, had warned her about certain places in these mountains. Places where the old spirits hadn't been properly laid to rest. Places where things that predated human memory still lingered. Emma grabbed her pack and started down the trail. Pete's tracks were easy to follow at first, the methodical gait of an experienced woodsman who knew where he was going. But about a half-mile in, something changed. The footprints became erratic, sometimes doubling back, sometimes veering off trail into the underbrush. In one muddy section, it looked like he'd been running. The fog seemed to thicken with every step, muffling sound until even her own breathing seemed distant. The massive cedars and hemlocks created a cathedral of green shadows, their canopy so thick that only the faintest light filtered through. Moss hung from branches like tattered curtains and nurse logs. Massive fallen trees that had become gardens for new growth crossed the trail like ancient bones. 2 miles in, she found Pete's jacket. It hung from a branch 15 feet up, torn nearly in half. There was no blood, but the fabric had been shredded with surgical precision, as if something had peeled it off him layer by layer. Emma's hand instinctively moved to her sidearm, though she knew a Glock wouldn't help against whatever had done this. A sound drifted through the fog, soft, rhythmic, like breathing. But it was coming from underground. Emma followed the sound off trail, pushing through sword ferns and salal, until she found herself at the edge of a depression in the forest floor. It was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and the vegetation around its rim was dead. Not just dead, but blackened and twisted, as if it had been burned from the inside out. At the center of the depression was a hole. It wasn't a natural formation. The edges were too perfect, carved into the bedrock with impossible precision. Strange symbols ran around the rim, not Native American, not anything Emma recognized from her anthropology degree. They seemed to writhe when she looked at them directly, making her eyes water. The breathing sound was definitely coming from down there. "Pete?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the fog. "Pete Wilson, this is Ranger Whitehorse. Are you injured?" The breathing stopped. Then, from deep in the hole came Pete's voice, but wrong, distorted, as if he was speaking through water. "Emma, don't. Come down." "It's awake." Every instinct screamed at her to run, to call for backup. to get as far from this place as possible. But Pete was down there. 70-year-old Pete, who'd taught her how to track elk her first year on the job, who brought homemade jerky to the station every Christmas, who'd saved 3 lost hikers just last spring despite his bad hip. Emma pulled out her flashlight and rope. The beam barely penetrated the darkness of the hole, revealing rough carved steps spiraling down into the earth. The air rising from below smelled wrong, metallic and sweet like rotting fruit mixed with copper. She anchored her rope to the sturdiest tree she could find and began her descent. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the first 10 feet. Her breath came out in clouds and frost began forming on the stone walls despite it being October. The symbols continued down the shaft, growing more complex, more disturbing. Some of them seemed to move in her peripheral vision, rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them. 30 feet down, the shaft opened into a cave. It shouldn't have existed. The geology was all wrong for this area. This was volcanic and sedimentary terrain, not limestone karst. But the cave stretched out before her, vast and impossible, its ceiling lost in darkness. Phosphorescent fungi provided a sickly green glow, revealing formations that defied natural explanation. Stalactites grew horizontally. Water flowed uphill in narrow channels, and the air itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched no human heartbeat. Pete was there. He stood in the center of the cave, his back to her, completely still. His shirt was gone and his skin was wrong. It had a translucent quality like wax paper, and she could see dark shapes moving beneath it, following the lines of his veins. "Pete," she whispered. He turned slowly, and Emma bit back a scream. His eyes were gone. Not gouged out, but filled with something black and viscous that moved with its own intelligence. When he smiled, his teeth had multiplied, row after row of them extending back into his throat like a shark's maw. "She's beautiful, Emma," Pete said, his voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "She's been sleeping so long, dreaming in the dark. But the mining company, they dug too deep in 71. Woke her up just a little. She took those hikers, fed on them, went back to sleep. But now she's really awake." "Pete, we need to get you to a hospital. You're sick, I'm becoming," he interrupted. "She's making me better, making all of us better. The others are already changing, can't you feel them?" Emma's flashlight beam swept the cave and she saw them. Bodies embedded in the walls like fossils, but breathing, pulsing. She recognized some of them. Hikers who'd gone missing over the decades, their missing persons files gathering dust in the ranger station. They were all alive, if you could call it that. Their bodies fused with the stone, feeding something deeper. At the far end of the cave, the floor sloped down into a pool of black water that reflected no light. Something vast moved beneath its surface, sending ripples that defied physics, flowing upward along the walls. "She was here before the forests," Pete continued, stepping closer. Emma could hear things crawling under his skin. "Before the mountains, before the first humans walked upright. The indigenous peoples knew. They sealed this place, made it taboo. But white men don't listen to warnings, do they? They had to dig, had to find gold." Emma backed toward the shaft, but Pete moved faster than any 70-year-old should, appearing behind her in a blink. His hand, too many fingers now, gripped her shoulder. "She needs an intermediary," he breathed, his breath smelling of deep earth and decay. "Someone who understands both worlds. Your blood is perfect, Emma. Indigenous and European, old and new. She can use you to spread." The black pool began to bubble and something rose from it. Emma's mind refused to process what she was seeing. It was too large, too complex, too alien. It had aspects of things she recognized. Tentacles like a deep-sea creature, wings like a bat, eyes like clusters of grapes. But they were arranged in ways that made no biological sense. It existed in more dimensions than 3, parts of it sliding in and out of visible reality. The entity spoke without words, its voice appearing directly in Emma's mind like ice crystals forming on glass. "I am the hunger between stars. I am the shadow cast by the first light. I have slept in the deep places. waiting for the earth to be ready for my garden. Emma's hand found the flare gun on her belt. It was a desperate, stupid move. But desperation and stupidity were all she had left. She fired it directly at the phosphorescent fungi covering the ceiling. The cave erupted in flame. The fungi burned with an intensity that shouldn't have been possible, spreading across the ceiling in seconds. The entity in the pool let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream. It was more like reality itself expressing pain. The bodies in the walls began writhing, pulling themselves free with wet, tearing sounds. Pete's grip loosened as he howled, the things under his skin fleeing the light and heat. Emma wrenched free and ran for the shaft, hauling herself up the rope, hand over hand, as the cave collapsed behind her. She could hear Pete following, no longer entirely human, making sounds no human throat could produce. She burst from the hole just as Pete's transformed hand, now a mass of writhing black tendrils, grabbed her ankle. The sunlight had finally broken through the fog, and when the rays touched Pete's altered flesh, it began to smoke and dissolve. He pulled himself partially out of the hole, and in the daylight, Emma could see what he'd become. His body had stretched and distorted, bones jutting at impossible angles, skin rippling with parasitic life. But in his eyes, his human eyes had returned for just a moment. She saw Pete. The real Pete, terrified and trapped. "Kill me," he gasped. "Please, before she takes me back, before I spread it." Emma drew her service weapon with shaking hands. Pete smiled, genuinely smiled, with what remained of his human face. "Tell Martha I loved her," he whispered. "Tell her I'm sorry I missed our anniversary." The shot echoed through the forest. Pete's body tumbled back into the hole, and Emma could hear it falling, bouncing off the walls, until the sound was swallowed by the depths. She stumbled back to the trail, calling for backup, for hazmat, for anyone. But when they arrived 2 hours later, the hole was gone. Not filled in, gone, as if it had never existed. The depression remained, the dead vegetation remained, but the entrance to that impossible cave had sealed itself. They found Pete's body 3 days later, washed up on the banks of the Solduke River 10 miles away. The coroner ruled it a drowning, confused by the bullet wound but unable to explain how he'd gotten into the river in the first place. Emma didn't correct them, but she knew it wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, more hikers went missing. Not many, just 1 or 2, enough to be concerning but not enough to close the park. Emma tracked them all, found the same signs: erratic movement, discarded clothing torn with surgical precision, depressions in the forest floor with blackened vegetation. She tried to warn her superiors, but without evidence, what could she say? That something pre-human was living beneath the Olympic Mountains? That it was spreading, taking people, transforming them into something else? They'd have her on psychiatric leave before she finished the sentence. So Emma did the only thing she could do. She patrolled. She watched. She guided hikers away from the danger zones with subtle misdirection. She left offerings at the old indigenous sacred sites, the way her grandmother had taught her, hoping the old protections might hold. On quiet nights at the ranger station, she researched. The symbols in the cave matched nothing in any archaeological database, but she found hints, references in medieval texts to things that sleep below, indigenous oral histories about the hungry darkness, mining records from the 1970s that abruptly stopped mid-sentence. 3 months after Pete's death, Emma was patrolling near Graves Creek when she heard it, that breathing sound coming from underground. She found another hole, another perfect spiral carved into bedrock. This time she didn't go down. She called it in, had the area cordoned off, claimed it was an old mine shaft that needed to be sealed for safety. They filled it with concrete the next day. That night, Emma camped nearby, watching. At exactly 3 a.m., the concrete cracked. Black water seeped through, pooling on the surface before retreating back into the earth. The crack sealed itself by dawn, but the message was clear. It was still down there, still waiting, still hungry. Emma requested a transfer the next week, citing family obligations. Her supervisor approved it, confused why their best senior ranger would suddenly want to leave. She couldn't explain that she wasn't running away, She was following the pattern. The disappearances weren't random. They formed a line, moving steadily northeast through the Cascades toward the populated areas of Puget Sound. The thing beneath the park was spreading, and Emma Whitehorse was the only one who knew. Her last day on the job, she stood at the Graves Creek turnout where she'd found Pete's truck 6 months earlier. The forest looked the same, ancient, misty, magnificently indifferent to human concerns. But Emma could feel it now, that presence underground, vast and patient and utterly alien. She left an offering at the trailhead, tobacco, sage, and a small obsidian knife her grandmother had given her. It was a futile gesture, she knew. You couldn't appease something that predated human concepts of appeasement, but it felt right, necessary, a small act of defiance against the hungry darkness. As she drove away, Emma saw movement in her rearview mirror. A figure stood at the forest edge, watching her leave. It might have been human once. It raised one too many jointed hand in what could have been a wave or a warning. She didn't stop. She had work to do, people to warn, a migration to track. The entity below Olympic National Park was only the first. Her research had found similar patterns globally, places where things that shouldn't exist were waking up, testing boundaries, preparing for something. Emma Whitehorse drove east into the rising sun, her truck loaded with maps, weapons, and her grandmother's journals. Behind her, the ancient forest kept its secrets, and beneath it, in the deep places where light had never reached, something vast and hungry continued to dream of the garden it would make of the world. The radio crackled with the morning ranger report. Another beautiful day in Olympic National Park. All trails clear, no incidents to report. Emma turned the radio off and kept driving. In the Olympic Mountains, the breathing continued, patient and eternal, waiting for the next curious soul to dig too deep. Superior National Forest, Minnesota. November 18th, 2024, 4:47 a.m. David Crow's breath crystallized in the pre-dawn air as he stepped out of the ranger station, his boots crunching against the frost-covered gravel. 38 years of life, 20 of them spent between these ancient pines and glacier-carved lakes, and still the forest before sunrise made him pause. The Boundary Waters canoe area. Wilderness stretched endlessly before him. 3 million acres of pristine wilderness where his Ojibwe ancestors had lived for countless generations, before the land became protected by the federal government. The radio on his belt crackled with static, breaking the profound silence that only existed in places untouched by civilization. David adjusted the volume, knowing that in less than an hour, the morning shift would begin their regular check-ins. For now, though, the forest belonged to him and the creatures that moved through the darkness. The barn owls whose haunting calls echoed across the lakes, the wolves whose tracks he'd been monitoring near Knife Lake, and the massive bull moose that had been frequenting the salt lick near the Gunflint Trail. He performed his morning ritual, checking his equipment with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of backcountry work. His pack contained the essentials: first aid kit, emergency beacon, flares, rope, water purification tablets, energy bars, thermal blanket, and the Remington 870 shotgun that regulations required but he'd never had to use. His grandfather's hunting knife, its handle worn smooth from 3 generations of use, rested in its sheath on his hip. The weather report promised clear skies and temperatures hovering around 28 degrees. Perfect conditions for the search and rescue training exercise scheduled for the afternoon. 3 rookie rangers would be learning grid search patterns in the densely forested area near Magnetic Rock, where the iron ore deposits played havoc with compasses and GPS units alike. David started his Ford F-150, letting the engine warm while he reviewed the overnight reports. Nothing unusual. A black bear had ransacked a poorly secured food cache at Campsite 42, and a group of college students had needed assistance after their canoe capsized in the frigid waters of Seagull Lake. They'd been lucky. Hypothermia set in fast this time of year, and the nearest hospital was 90 minutes away in Grand Marais. As he drove along the narrow Forest Service road, his headlights caught the reflection of eyes in the darkness. A family of white-tailed deer grazing near the road's edge. They lifted their heads, alert but not alarmed, as he passed. David had always felt a deep connection to the wildlife here. His grandmother had taught him that every creature had its purpose, its place in the great web of life that connected all things. Even the wolves, which many locals still viewed with suspicion and fear, were essential to maintaining the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The sun was beginning to paint the eastern horizon in shades of amber and rose when David arrived at the Sawbill Lake entry point. He parked and walked to the shore, where mist rose from the water's surface like ghostly dancers. The lake was a mirror, perfectly reflecting the surrounding pines and the gradually lightening sky. A pair of loons called to each other across the water, their mournful cries carrying for miles in the still air. This was why he'd returned home after college, forsaking a lucrative career in environmental law to follow in his father's footsteps as a ranger. The forest was in his blood, its rhythms as familiar as his own heartbeat. He knew which plants could heal and which could kill, could read the weather and the behavior of birds, could track a wounded animal for miles through terrain that would defeat most outdoorsmen. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena Rodriguez, the senior ranger who managed the district. "David, need you at station ASAP. Missing hiker, college student. Parents driving up from Minneapolis." David's peaceful morning evaporated. Missing hikers were unfortunately common, especially in November when experienced outdoors people underestimated how quickly conditions could deteriorate. He jogged back to his truck, already mentally preparing for what would likely be a long day of searching. The ranger station was bustling with activity when he arrived. Elena stood at the large topographical map on the wall, marking potential search areas with red pins. She was flanked by Tom Winters, the newest addition to their team, whose military background showed in his ramrod posture and precisely pressed uniform, and Sarah Blackwood, whose expertise in wildlife biology often proved invaluable during searches. "What do we have?" David asked, grabbing a cup of coffee from the pot that was perpetually brewing in the corner. Elena turned, her weathered face etched with concern. Jennifer Hayes, 22, University of Minnesota student, entered the park 3 days ago for a solo photography trip. She was supposed to check in with her roommate yesterday evening but never called. Her car's still at the Caribou Rock trailhead. David studied the map. The Caribou Rock Trail was challenging even for experienced hikers. 15 miles of rugged terrain that wound through dense forest and crossed several streams that would be running high with snowmelt. 3 days ago, she would have hit that cold snap we had. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees overnight. "That's what worries me," Elena said. According to her roommate, she's an experienced hiker but has never done winter camping. She had a tent and sleeping bag, but we don't know if they were rated for those temperatures. Tom Winters studied his tablet, pulling up weather data. Sun sets at 4:43 p.m. That gives us less than 11 hours of daylight. If she's injured or suffering from exposure... He didn't need to finish. They all knew the statistics. In near-freezing temperatures, an injured hiker could succumb to hypothermia in a matter of hours. Sarah Blackwood was examining Jennifer's social media posts on her phone. She's been documenting her trip on Instagram. Last post was 3 days ago, a sunrise shot from Eagle Mountain. She mentioned wanting to photograph the aurora borealis from Magnetic Rock. David's blood ran cold. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, speaking in Ojibwe-Mowen, warning him about certain places in the forest. Magnetic Rock was one of them. A place where the old story said the boundary between worlds grew thin, where hunters who ventured too far in winter sometimes returned changed if they returned at all. "I'll take Magnetic Rock," David said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I know that area better than anyone." Elena nodded. "Tom, you and Sarah take the main trail. Check every campsite and shelter. I'll coordinate from here and handle the parents when they arrive. Amanda Cross is driving down from the tower station to help with the search." David gathered his gear, adding extra supplies to his pack: emergency thermal blankets, chemical heat packs, high-energy gel packets. As he loaded his equipment into his truck, he noticed something that made him pause. The birds had gone silent. Not the normal quiet of morning feeding time, but an absolute absence of sound that pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. He'd experienced this silence only once before, 15 years ago, when he'd been tracking an injured elk through a remote section of the forest. He'd found the elk eventually, or what remained of it. The carcass had been stripped of meat with surgical precision, the bones cracked open for marrow, arranged in a pattern that had made his grandfather cross himself when David described it. The drive to Magnetic Rock took 40 minutes along increasingly rough Forest Service roads. As he drove, David tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. Jennifer Hayes was probably just lost, maybe nursing a twisted ankle in one of the many granite outcroppings that gave the area its name. The strange silence was just coincidence, nothing more. But his grandmother had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him something was terribly wrong. The parking area near Magnetic Rock was empty except for a blue Honda Civic with a University of Minnesota parking sticker. David called in the license plate. It matched Jennifer Hayes' registration. He examined the car carefully. No signs of struggle. Nothing unusual except for a parking ticket that had been placed 3 days ago, meaning she hadn't returned to move her vehicle as planned. David shouldered his pack and set off down the trail, his practiced eye scanning for any sign of disturbance. The path was well marked for the first 2 miles, winding through stands of paper birch and balsam fir. He found Jennifer's tracks easily enough. Size 7 hiking boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. She'd been moving at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to take photographs based on the tripod marks he found in the soft earth. As he climbed higher, approaching the magnetic anomaly that gave the rock its name, David noticed the first signs that something was amiss. The tracks became erratic, as if Jennifer had been running, then walking, then running again. At one point, she'd left the trail entirely, crashing through the underbrush for 30 yards before returning to the path. David followed her deviation from the trail, pushing through the thick undergrowth. That's when he found the first piece of equipment, her camera, an expensive Nikon DSLR, hanging from a broken branch. The camera was still functional, and David scrolled through the recent photos. Sunrise shots, pictures of frost patterns on leaves, a curious gray jay. Then the photos became strange. Blurry shots of trees, dozens of them, all taken at odd angles as if she'd been photographing something moving through the forest. The last photo made David's blood run cold. It was taken at night, the flash illuminating a figure standing between the trees perhaps 50 feet away. The figure was impossibly tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its head turned at an angle that human anatomy shouldn't allow. Where its eyes should have been were 2 points of reflected light, like a deer caught in headlights, but wrong. Predatory rather than prey. David pocketed the camera and continued following Jennifer's trail. The temperature was dropping as clouds rolled in from the northwest, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. He found more of her equipment scattered along the path, a water bottle still half full, a hiking pole bent at an unusual angle, a torn piece of her jacket caught on a thorny bush. The tracks led him deeper into the forest, away from the established trails and into an area he rarely patrolled. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and scarred by centuries of storms and fires. The magnetic interference was strong enough that his compass spun uselessly, and his GPS unit showed his location jumping erratically across the map. It was here that David found the first blood. Not much, just a few drops on a patch of moss, but enough to confirm his worst fears. The blood trail led to a small clearing where the snow hadn't yet begun to accumulate. The ground was disturbed, torn up as if there had been a struggle. Jennifer's backpack lay abandoned near a fallen log, its contents scattered across the forest floor. David knelt beside the pack, cataloging what remained. Her tent and sleeping bag were gone, as were most of her food supplies. But her emergency beacon was still there, unused. Why hadn't she activated it? The device was in perfect working condition, its battery fully charged. A sound made him freeze, a branch snapping somewhere behind him. David's hand moved instinctively to his shotgun as he turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but he had the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had stilled. "Jennifer?" he called out, his voice seeming to die just feet from his mouth, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Jennifer Hayes? This is Ranger David Crow. I'm here to help you. The response came not in words, but in a sound that raised every hair on David's body. A low, gurgling moan that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It was almost human, but wrong in every way that mattered, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of ice and gravel. David chambered around in his shotgun, the metallic sound sharp in the silence. "I'm armed," he announced to the forest. "If someone's out there, identify yourself." The moaning stopped, replaced by something worse. Laughter. Not the laughter of joy or even madness, but something hollow and hungry, like wind through a cave full of bones. Movement caught his eye, a flash of red against the white birch bark. Jennifer's jacket. David moved toward it cautiously, weapon at the ready. The jacket hung from a branch 12 feet off the ground, torn and stained with what looked like blood and something else. A black tar-like substance that gave off a putrid smell. How had it gotten so high? The nearest climbing holds on the tree were minimal, and Jennifer, according to her file, was only 5'4". David's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "David, this is Elena. Status report?" He keyed the mic with a trembling hand. "I've found her equipment and signs of a struggle. Blood trail. Requesting immediate backup at my GPS coordinates." "Copy that. Tom and Sarah are 40 minutes from your position. We've got state police en route as well. Any sign of the subject?" Before David could respond, he heard it, a voice weak and terrified calling from deeper in the forest. "Help me. Please. Someone help me." It was a young woman's voice. It had to be Jennifer. "I've got voice contact," David reported, moving to investigate. "David, wait for backup." He turned the volume down on his radio. 40 minutes was too long if Jennifer was injured and exposed to the elements. The snow was falling heavier now, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees in the last hour. David followed the voice, moving carefully through the increasingly dense underbrush. The trees seemed to press in around him, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. The voice continued, pleading, sobbing, always just ahead, leading him deeper into the wilderness. After 10 minutes of pursuit, David stopped. Something was wrong. The voice hadn't gotten any closer despite how far he'd traveled. And there was something about its quality, a repetitive nature to the pleas, like a recording being played on a loop. His grandmother's stories came flooding back. The Wendigo, the creature that had once been human, transformed by the consumption of human flesh during a harsh winter. It could mimic human voices, they said, to lure victims away from safety. It was always hungry, always hunting, its appetite never satisfied. David began backing up slowly, keeping his weapon raised. The voice continued, but now he could hear the deception in it. The words were right, but the emotion was wrong, like an actor reading from a script they didn't understand. A twig snapped behind him. David spun around to find Amanda Cross, the rookie ranger from Tower Station, standing 10 feet away. Relief flooded through him. "Amanda, thank God. We need to..." The words died in his throat. Amanda was wearing a summer uniform despite the near-freezing temperature. No jacket, no gloves, no equipment. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and when she smiled, her teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Hello, David," she said, and her voice was wrong, layered as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "We've been waiting for you." David raised his shotgun. "Stop right there." Amanda tilted her head at an impossible angle, her neck extending like putty. "Your grandmother told you stories, didn't she? About the old hunger, the winter walker, the thing that wears human skin." "Where's Jennifer Hayes?" David demanded, his finger on the trigger. "Jennifer?" Amanda laughed, that hollow, hungry sound. She was delicious, so warm, so full of life. But not enough. Never enough. The hunger never stops, David. It grows and grows until it consumes everything. David's mind raced. Amanda Cross had been a real person. He'd met her at the orientation last week. Young, eager, fresh out of college with a degree in forestry. What was this thing wearing her face? "You're not Amanda," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. No, the thing agreed, taking a step closer. Its movements were wrong, joints bending in ways that defied human anatomy. Amanda came looking for the missing girl 2 nights ago. Alone, brave, stupid. She tasted of ambition and fear. David fired. The blast echoed through the forest, and the thing that looked like Amanda staggered back. Black ichor leaked from the wound in its chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it laughed again. "Iron pellets," it said, looking down at the wound with curiosity. "Your ancestors knew better. They used silver, blessed by the medicine men, wrapped in sage and sweetgrass." The wound was already closing, the black substance sealing it like tar. David backed away, pumping another round into the chamber. "You can't kill hunger, David," the creature said, its form beginning to shift and stretch. "You can only feed it or become it." The transformation was horrific. Amanda's skin split like an overripe fruit, revealing something underneath that defied description. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs like twisted tree branches and a skull that was too long, too narrow. Its eyes were sunken pits that somehow still gleamed with intelligence and endless, terrible hunger. The Wendigo stood before him in its true form, a nightmare made flesh reeking of decay and old blood. David ran. Behind him he could hear it following, not running but moving with an unnatural gait that covered ground too quickly. The forest became a blur as David crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. His radio bounced against his hip, voices crackling through it. Elena calling for his status. Tom reporting they'd found another body. Sarah screaming about something in the trees. The creature wasn't just hunting him, it was herding him, driving him toward some predetermined destination. David realized this when he burst into a clearing and found himself at the base of Magnetic Rock itself, the massive iron-rich formation looming above him like a primordial altar. The clearing was a charnel house. Bodies in various states of decay were arranged in a grotesque pattern around the rock. David recognized some of them, hikers who'd gone missing over the past 5 years, their disappearances attributed to accidents or wildlife attacks. In the center, tied to the rock itself, was Jennifer Hayes. She was alive, barely. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she tried to speak through cracked, frostbitten lips. "Run," she managed to whisper. The Wendigo emerged from the forest, no longer bothering to hurry. It knew David had nowhere to go. "Do you know why this place is special, David?" it asked, its voice like wind through a cemetery. "The magnetic field here is unique. It creates a thin spot between worlds, between what is and what hungers to be. Your ancestors knew this. They fed it to keep it contained. Criminals, enemies, volunteers who drew the short straw. But then came civilization, laws, morality. The feeding stopped and the hunger grew." David positioned himself between the creature and Jennifer, his shotgun raised. "The others will be here soon. You can't kill us all." "I don't need to," the Wendigo said. "I only need one more. The hunger has grown so vast that it needs a new vessel, someone strong enough to carry it into the modern world. Someone who knows both the old ways and the new. Someone like you, David Crow." The temperature plummeted. Frost spread across the ground in spirals, and David's breath came out in thick clouds. The Wendigo began to circle them, its movements hypnotic, almost beautiful in their alien grace. "You feel it, don't you?" it whispered. "The emptiness inside, the dissatisfaction with modern life, the yearning for something more primal, more real. That's the hunger calling to you. It's been calling your bloodline for generations." David did feel something, a gnawing sensation in his gut that had nothing to do with the energy bar he'd eaten for breakfast. It was deeper, older, a void that seemed to expand with each passing second. "Your great-great-grandfather knew the hunger," the Wendigo continued. "During the winter of 1854, when the snows came early and the hunting failed. He led his family deep into these woods, and when the food ran out, he made the choice. He fed the hunger with his youngest son, told the others the boy had wandered off and frozen. But the guilt transformed him. He became like me, Walked these woods for 30 years before your great-grandfather finally ended him with a silver bullet blessed by 7 medicine men. David's hand shook. He'd heard fragments of this story, whispered mentions of a family shame that was never fully explained. Jennifer moaned, drawing his attention. The ropes binding her to the rock were cutting into her wrists, and her skin had taken on a dangerous blue tinge. "Let her go," David said. "Take me instead." The Wendigo stopped circling. "You would trade your life for a stranger's?" "It's my duty." Duty. The creature seemed to taste the word. Such a filling concept, full of honor and purpose and sacrifice. Yes, you would make a perfect vessel. It moved toward him, and David pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, his hands trembling too much to aim properly. The Wendigo didn't even flinch. "The transformation is painful," it said, reaching out with one impossibly long arm. "But brief. You'll feel your humanity slip away like a coat you no longer need. The hunger will fill you, become you, and you'll finally understand true freedom. The freedom from conscience, from empathy, from everything that makes you weak." David's radio erupted with voices. "Visual on the clearing. Jesus Christ, what is that thing? Open fire, open fire!" Tom Winters and Sarah Blackwood burst from the tree line, weapons raised. Tom's military training kicked in immediately, and he put 3-round center mass into the Wendigo. Sarah flanked to the right, firing her own weapon while shouting into her radio for backup. The Wendigo roared, a sound that was felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. It turned toward the new threats, momentarily forgetting David. That was all the opportunity he needed. David dropped his shotgun and pulled his grandfather's knife, the blade that had been passed down through generations. As his hand closed around the worn handle, he remembered something his grandmother had said. The blade remembers what the mind forgets. The knife grew warm in his hand, and he could swear he heard whispers in Ojibwe-Moan, prayers, incantations, the voices of his ancestors. David charged. The Wendigo, focused on Tom and Sarah, didn't see him coming. He drove the blade deep into the creature's back, between what would have been ribs on a human. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that shattered the windows in Tom's vehicle 100 yards away. Black ichor erupted from the wound, sizzling where it touched the ground. "No!" the creature howled, spinning to face David. "That blade was destroyed. Your grandfather—" "Made a replica to fool you," David finished. "The real one was hidden, protected, waiting." The Wendigo lunged at him, but its movements were sluggish now, weakened. David pulled the knife free and stabbed again, this time in the chest. The creature fell to its knees, its form beginning to shift and bubble like melting wax. "The hunger," it gasped, looking up at David with eyes that were suddenly terribly human. "The hunger never dies. It only waits. And now? Now it passes to—" The Wendigo collapsed, its body decomposing rapidly into a black sludge that seeped into the frozen ground. Within seconds, nothing remained but a dark stain on the snow. David dropped to his knees, exhausted. Tom was already cutting Jennifer free while Sarah called for medical evacuation. The girl was unconscious but breathing, her pulse weak but steady. "What the hell was that thing?" Tom asked, his military composure finally cracking. David looked at the stain on the ground, then at his grandfather's knife. The blade was clean, showing no sign of the black ichor that had covered it moments before. "Something old," David said. "Something that should have stayed forgotten." Sarah knelt beside him, checking for injuries. "The bodies in the clearing, there must be a dozen of them. How did no one know?" "People go missing in the wilderness all the time," David replied, his voice hollow. "We find some. We don't find others. We blame bears' exposure getting lost. We don't talk about the other possibilities." The medical helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, airlifting Jennifer to the hospital in Duluth. She would survive, the doctors said, though she would lose several fingers and toes to frostbite. She wouldn't remember much of her ordeal. Trauma-induced amnesia, the psychologists would explain, though David suspected it was more than that. Some mercies were granted even in the darkest moments. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. The official report blamed the deaths on a serial killer who had been using the remote wilderness to hide his crimes. The suspect, described as a drifter with severe psychological issues, was listed as deceased, killed in a confrontation with rangers. No mention was made of the creature's true nature or the physical impossibilities witnessed by 3 trained officers. Amanda Cross's body was found a week later, hidden in a cave 2 miles from Magnetic Rock. She'd been dead for 3 days when the Wendigo took her form. The coroner's report was sealed, the details deemed too disturbing for public release. David returned to work after a month of administrative leave. The forest felt different now, not threatening, but watchful. He could feel eyes on him during his patrols, not hostile but curious, waiting, sometimes, on cold nights when the moon was dark. He would hear whispers in the wind, voices speaking in languages older than English, older than memory. The hunger the Wendigo had spoken of was real. David felt it sometimes, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of food could fill. It was weaker than what the creature had carried, diluted by generations of distance from its origin. But it was there. His grandmother had felt it. His grandfather had felt it. And now he understood why his family had always been drawn to these woods, why they had always been the ones to stand guard. 3 months after the incident, David was doing a routine patrol near Magnetic Rock when he found something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow, barefoot despite the freezing temperature with too many toes and a stride length that didn't match any human gait. He followed the tracks to a small altar made of bones and stones, arranged in a pattern he recognized from his grandmother's drawings. In the center was a piece of paper, new but written in an old hand. The message was in Ojibwe Moan, but David could read it. The hunger never dies, it only sleeps, and when it wakes it will call to the blood that carries it. Be ready, David Crow. The winter is long, and the forest is hungry. David burned the note and scattered the altar, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The Wendigo he'd killed had been just one manifestation of something much older, much larger. The hunger existed before it, and would exist after. All he could do was stand watch, as his ancestors had, and hope that when the hunger rose again, someone would be ready to face it. As he walked back to his truck, David noticed the birds had returned. Chickadees and nuthatches flitted through the trees, their calls bright and normal. A barred owl hooted in the distance, and somewhere, a wolf howled, not in threat, but in simple acknowledgement of the coming night. The forest was at peace for now. But David knew, as his grandmother had known, as all who carried the old blood knew, that peace in the wilderness was always temporary. The hunger would return. It always did. And when it did, David Crow would be waiting, his grandfather's knife sharp and ready, standing between the modern world and the ancient hunger that lurked in the spaces between the trees, in the shadows where the old gods still walked, and human flesh was just another offering to the eternal gnawing void. The snow continued to fall, covering the dark stains in the clearing, hiding the evidence of what had transpired. By morning, the forest would look pristine and untouched, a winter wonderland that would draw more hikers, more photographers, more people seeking adventure in the wilderness. David would watch them come and go, would guide them when they got lost, would search for them when they didn't return. It was his duty, his burden, his inheritance. And sometimes on the coldest nights, when the aurora borealis danced across the sky and the magnetic rocks sang their ancient song, he would feel the knife grow warm against his hip and know that his watch had only just begun. The forest kept its secrets, and David Crow kept his vigil, 2 guardians bound by blood and necessity, waiting for the next time the hunger woke and walked on 2 legs through the endless winter woods of the north. The static came first. Daniel Brenner had been a ranger at Olympic National Park for 12 years, long enough to know every whisper the forest made. The Hoh rainforest sector was his domain, a temperate jungle where moss hung like funeral shrouds and the canopy blocked satellite signals with religious devotion. But this October morning in 2008, something was wrong with the frequencies. His Motorola XTS 5000 portable radio crackled against his hip as he navigated the Hoh River Trail. The device was supposed to maintain clear communication within the park's repeater network, but today it picked up things that shouldn't exist. Fragments, whispers between the designated channels. Base, this is Brenner. I'm getting interference on all bands. Over. The response came through layered with white noise. Copy that, Dan. We're experiencing similar issues. Solar activity, maybe. Continue to Tyler Morrison's last known position. Over. Tyler Morrison, 23 years old. Experienced solo hiker from Portland. His Spot GPS messenger had sent its last ping 36 hours ago, deep in the backcountry near Mount Tom Creek. The device was designed to work even under heavy canopy, broadcasting position updates via satellite every 10 minutes. Tyler's had simply stopped. Dan adjusted his pack, feeling the weight of his search and rescue gear. The Garmin GPS map 60 CSX in his hand showed Tyler's last coordinates. 47.8614 degree 9, 123.9347 degree ba, 4 miles northeast, elevation 2,400 feet. The trail would take him through some of the densest old-growth forest in the continental United States. As he hiked deeper, the radio interference intensified. He switched through the channels, 154.600, 154.625, 154.650, each one carrying the same underlying static. No, not static. There was a pattern to it, like breathing through electronic lungs. At mile marker 2, he found the first sign. A Deuter Acid Light 65 Plus and 10 backpack, Tyler's according to the missing person report, sitting perfectly upright beside the trail. Not dropped or abandoned, placed. Dan photographed it with his digital camera, documenting the scene. The pack's contents were meticulously organized. Freeze-dried meals for 5 days, water purification tablets, first aid kit, everything a competent hiker would carry. Tyler's iPhone was in the top pocket. Battery dead. Base, I've located Morrison's pack at coordinates 47.8472 degree, 123.9289 degree W. Appears intentionally placed. No signs of struggle. Continuing search. Over. The reply was barely intelligible through the interference. Between the static bursts, Dan could have sworn he heard something else. Voices. Young voices. He continued northeast, following the game trails Tyler might have taken. The October air was thick with moisture, that particular Pacific Northwest dampness that made everything feel like it was slowly drowning. The Sitka spruces towered above, some over 300 feet tall, their bases wider than his ranger cabin. In the undergrowth, sword ferns created a green maze that could disorient even experienced hikers. His radio crackled again. This time, when he lifted it to respond, he heard them clearly. Children. Singing. The melody was simple, like a nursery rhyme, but the words were incomprehensible. Not foreign. Wrong. Like someone had taken English and bent it sideways. The singing came through on 154.675 MHz, a frequency that shouldn't exist on his radio. The channels jumped in increments of 0.025, not 0.075. Dan stopped walking. In 12 years, he'd never encountered anything he couldn't explain with logic and forest science. Bears, hypothermia, dehydration, panic-induced poor decisions. These were the real dangers, not whatever this was. He tried to tune back to the base frequency, but the singing followed him across the channels. Different voices now. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, reciting numbers. 47.8614. 123.9347. He's here. He's here. He's here with us now. Those were Tyler's last coordinates. Dan's hand moved to his Glock 20, standard issue for areas with aggressive wildlife. The 10mm auto rounds were meant for brown bears, but the gesture was purely reflexive. Whatever was happening here wasn't going to be solved with bullets. He pushed through a curtain of moss and entered a small clearing. The ground was disturbed, not violently, but deliberately. Someone had been digging. Several shallow depressions dotted the forest floor, each about the size of a grave but only a foot deep. In the center of the clearing, a ham radio setup that had no business being here. a Yaesu FT897D transceiver connected to a car battery, and a makeshift antenna strung between two hemlocks. The radio was on, its LCD display showing 146.520 MHz, the national simplex calling frequency. But the audio coming through wasn't from any ham operator. It was the children again, and this time they were crying. "Please," a boy's voice sobbed through the speaker. "Please, we can't get out." The space between is getting smaller. Dan keyed his own radio. "Base, I need backup at my current position. I've found unauthorized radio equipment and..." His transmission cut off as every electronic device he carried suddenly screamed to life. The GPS displayed impossible coordinates, latitudes and longitudes that didn't exist on Earth. His radio cycled through frequencies so fast the display became a blur of numbers. Even his digital watch was affected, the LCD showing times that jumped between years. Then, silence. In that silence, he heard actual footsteps. Tyler Morrison emerged from the tree line, but something was catastrophically wrong. The young man moved in stuttering jerks like a film missing frames. His eyes were open but showed only white. His mouth moved, and Dan realized with growing horror that Tyler was the source of the children's voices. "We tried to warn everyone," a little girl's voice said from Tyler's throat. "The radio waves here are thin, the space between stations. That's where it lives." Tyler's body convulsed, and when his mouth opened again, it was a different child. A boy. It's been feeding for so long. Native children first, then the settlers' kids. Now it doesn't matter who. It just needs voices for its collection. Dan backed away, his hand finding his radio again out of pure habit. "Tyler, can you hear me? Tyler Morrison, respond if you can hear me." Tyler's head snapped toward him with mechanical precision. When he spoke again, it was his own voice, barely a whisper. "It's in the frequencies, between them, in the spaces we can't tune to. It took them all, keeps them there. And now it has me too." The unauthorized radio behind Dan burst into cacophony. Dozens of children's voices, all speaking at once, creating a wall of sound that made his teeth ache. Among them, he could identify patterns, counting, singing, pleading, screaming. How many children had vanished in these woods over the decades? How many missing person cases had been attributed to the dangers of the wilderness? Tyler collapsed to his knees, and when he looked up, his eyes had rolled back to normal. But the expression on his face was one of absolute terror. "It wants you to know," he gasped in his own voice. "It's been trying to tell someone for years. The children, they're not dead. They're transmitted, converted into signals, stored in the spaces between frequencies. And it needs more, always more." The trees around them began to resonate with radio interference, a physical sensation Dan felt in his bones. His radio equipment was going haywire again, but this time he could see the pattern. The frequencies were opening up, showing spaces that shouldn't exist. 144, no 1, 144, no 2, 144, no 3. Infinite subdivisions between the authorized channels. "Run," Tyler whispered. "It's coming through." Dan saw it then, though his mind refused to process what he was seeing. The air itself was tuning, shifting between states like someone turning a dial. In those spaces between frequencies, something vast and hungry moved. It had no true form because it existed in the gaps, in the places where signals went to die. But it had learned to speak through the children it had collected, and their voices were its lure. The thing reached through the frequency space, and where it touched reality, the forest pixelated like a corrupted digital image. Trees became vertical lines of static. The ground transformed into waveforms, and in those distortions, Dan could see them. Dozens of children from different eras, their images superimposed like double exposures. Native American children in traditional dress, pioneer kids from the 1800s, modern children in Nike shoes and Pokemon shirts, all of them trapped in the transmission, their voices the only part of them that could still reach the physical world. Tyler screamed, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was all of them, harmonizing in a frequency that made Dan's ears bleed. The young man's body began to fade, becoming translucent like a weak signal. Dan lunged forward, grabbing Tyler's arm, trying to anchor him to reality. "Base!" Dan shouted into his radio, not knowing if anyone could hear him. "Emergency at grid reference 47.8614, 123.9347. We have a code 3000, repeat code 3000. There was no such code. He was making it up, but he needed them to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Through the static, he heard a response, barely audible. "Dan, your signal is breaking up. Say again your status." "Multiple victims," he yelled, still holding on to Tyler as the young man flickered between solid and signal. "Children. There are children in the frequencies." The entity pushed harder through the space between stations. Dan felt his own atoms wanting to separate, to become waveform and join the transmission. Every filling in his teeth became a receiver. The iron in his blood turned into an antenna. He was becoming conductive to something that shouldn't exist. Tyler's mouth moved again, and this time it was an older child's voice, maybe a teenager. It came with the first radio experiments, Marconi, Tesla. They opened something they didn't understand. It was already ancient, living in the electromagnetic spectrum, but their transmissions gave it form, gave it hunger. Dan's radio suddenly locked onto a clear frequency. Through the speaker came his supervisor's voice, distorted but understandable. "Dan, we've got massive electromagnetic anomalies on the seismic equipment. The entire park is lighting up. What's your status?" Before he could respond, Tyler's body gave one final shudder and dispersed into static. Not disappeared, dispersed. Dan could still see him, but he was spread across multiple frequencies simultaneously, his image stuttering between channels like someone rapidly turning a television dial. "No." Dan reached for where Tyler had been, but his hands passed through empty air that tasted of copper and ozone. On his radio, he could hear Tyler joining the chorus of children, his voice now part of their eternal broadcast. The entity, satisfied with its new acquisition, began to recede back into the frequency gaps. The forest slowly returned to normal, pixels becoming bark, waveforms becoming solid ground. But the damage was done. Dan's equipment was fried, the circuits fused into incomprehensible patterns. The unauthorized radio station was nothing but melted plastic and copper. He stood there in the clearing, shaking, trying to process what had happened. His rational mind wanted to categorize it as a hallucination, maybe exposure to some kind of toxic gas or electromagnetic field. But the blood running from his ears was real. The burns on his hands from where he'd touched Tyler were real, and the voices on the radio were real. He hiked back toward the trailhead in a daze, his body on autopilot while his mind reeled. Every few minutes, his damaged radio would spark to life, picking up impossible transmissions. The children were always there, just outside the normal frequency ranges, trying to warn others, or simply crying for help that would never come. By the time he reached his vehicle, a full search and rescue operation was being mobilized. The electromagnetic anomaly had been detected by equipment as far away as Seattle, but Dan knew they wouldn't find anything. Tyler Morrison would be listed as another disappearance, another victim of the unforgiving wilderness. That night, in his cabin at the Ho Ranger Station, Dan wrote his report. He documented everything precisely, included all his observations, no matter how impossible they seemed. His supervisor, Janet Mills, read it the next morning and immediately placed him on administrative leave. "Dan," she said, not unkindly, "you've been through something traumatic. Tyler Morrison is still missing, and I think the stress—" "Test the frequencies," he interrupted. "Put someone on a ham radio and have them scan between the channels, the spaces that shouldn't exist. 144.01, 144.02. They're there, Janet. The children are all there." She looked at him with concern, the kind reserved for colleagues who'd finally cracked under the pressure of the job. But to her credit, she made a note. "I'll have someone check it out. In the meantime, take some time, process what happened." Dan left the Park Service 3 months later. The official report listed Tyler Morrison as missing, presumed dead, likely victim of a fall in the treacherous terrain. The unauthorized radio equipment was cataloged as evidence of illegal camping, probably set up by poachers or drug manufacturers. No one talked about the electromagnetic anomaly, though the data was quietly archived by people in departments that didn't officially exist. But Dan kept a radio, a simple handheld scanner he bought from a surplus store. Late at night, when the atmospheric conditions were just right, he would tune to the spaces between frequencies, and he would listen. They were always there, the frequency children. Dozens of them now, maybe hundreds, their voices overlapping in an endless chorus of warning and despair. Sometimes he could pick out individual voices, a girl singing a song from the 1950s, a boy reciting baseball statistics from games that happened before radio was invented, Tyler Morrison giving hiking advice to no one. The thing that collected them was patient. It had existed in the electromagnetic spectrum since before humans discovered radio waves, and it would exist long after the last transmission faded into cosmic background radiation. It fed on consciousness converted to signal, on the essence of life transformed into frequency. And it was always hungry. Dan tried to warn others. He posted on forums, contacted researchers, even reached out to Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM. Most dismissed him as another cryptid enthusiast or conspiracy theorist. But occasionally, someone would message him privately. Another ranger who'd experienced strange transmissions. A ham radio operator who'd heard voices where no voices should be. Parents whose children had vanished in areas with high electromagnetic activity. He compiled their stories looking for patterns. The entity seemed drawn to places where the barrier between frequencies was naturally thin. Mountain passes, dense forests, areas with high mineral content that affected radio waves. It preferred children, though Dan suspected this was because their consciousness was more easily converted to signal, less anchored to physical reality. The Olympic National Park, with its massive trees and electromagnetic anomalies caused by the nearby Pacific Ocean, was a perfect hunting ground. How many missing hikers over the decades had actually been taken into the frequencies? How many voices were trapped in those impossible spaces between channels? 5 years after Tyler Morrison's disappearance, Dan received a package with no return address. Inside was an old vacuum tube radio from the 1940s, the kind that could tune to incredibly precise frequencies. There was also a note, handwritten in a child's scrawl. The space between stations is getting crowded. It needs to expand. Soon it won't just be the wilderness. Cities have frequencies too. Help us or join us. Dan plugged in the radio that night. As the tubes warmed up, he heard them immediately, clearer than ever before. The frequency children, their voices layered like a choir of the damned. But behind them, something else. The sound of the entity itself, breathing in electromagnetic waves, growing stronger with each voice it collected. He turned the dial slowly, moving through the spaces between stations. At 88.001 FM, he heard a news broadcast from a future that hadn't happened yet, reporting on mass disappearances in Seattle. At 101.999, children were singing a song that wouldn't be written for another decade. The entity was affecting time itself through the frequencies, creating paradoxes in the electromagnetic spectrum. Then, at exactly 144.144 MHz, he heard his own voice. "Hello, Dan," his voice said from the radio, though his mouth hadn't moved. "You've been listening for so long you're already partially converted. Every night you tune in, you become more signal, less flesh. The entity appreciates your dedication. You're helping it understand how to reach more listeners." Dan jerked away from the radio, but it was too late. He could feel it now, the pull of the frequencies, the desire to dissolve into pure transmission. His body was becoming a wavering signal, solid one moment, translucent the next. The children's voices grew louder, welcoming him to their eternal broadcast. He fought it, grounding himself in physical sensation, the pain in his arthritic knee from an old hiking injury, the taste of the coffee he'd drunk that morning, the weight of his body in the chair. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself back from the edge of dissolution. But he understood now. Everyone who listened for too long eventually joined the frequency children. The entity didn't just take people, It converted those who searched for the missing, adding their voices to the chorus. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of loss and seeking. Dan destroyed the vacuum tube radio with a hammer, but he could still hear them. Once you tuned into those impossible frequencies, you never really tuned out. They were always there, just beneath the surface of normal broadcasting, waiting. He moved to the desert, as far from the electromagnetic anomalies of the Pacific Northwest as he could get. But even in the silence of the Mojave, with no radio for miles, he could hear them when the wind was right. The frequency children, forever calling out from the spaces between stations, warning others about the thing that collected voices like others collected stamps. Tyler Morrison's parents never got closure. The search was eventually called off, his case filed away with thousands of other wilderness disappearances. But sometimes ham radio operators in the Portland area reported strange transmissions late at night. A young man giving detailed hiking advice for trails in Olympic National Park. His voice always preceded by a burst of static that sounded almost like children singing. Dan documented everything he could, creating a record for whoever might find it. He knew that one day, probably soon, he would succumb to the pull of the frequencies. He was already more signal than flesh. His consciousness spread thin across multiple channels. But maybe his warnings would help someone else understand what was happening in the spaces between stations. The entity was growing stronger, feeding on an increasingly connected world. Every new frequency band, every advancement in wireless technology, gave it more space to inhabit. 5G towers were especially problematic. Their higher frequencies created even more spaces between channels, more room for the entity to expand its collection. In his final entry, dated October 15, 2013, exactly 5 years after Tyler Morrison's disappearance, Dan wrote, "If you're reading this, stay off the radios. Don't listen for the voices no matter how much you want to help them. They're bait, whether they mean to be or not. The entity uses our compassion against us, turning search and rescue into recruitment. The frequency children aren't suffering exactly. They exist in a state outside of time, their consciousness preserved in electromagnetic amber. But they're not alive either. They're echoes of who they were, playing on endless repeat in the spaces we were never meant to tune into. I can feel myself slipping between frequencies now. My molecules are vibrating at rates that shouldn't be possible. Soon I'll be another voice in the chorus warning people who won't listen, calling out from between the stations. If you hear me on the radio, don't answer. Don't try to find me. Just turn it off and walk away." The spaces between frequencies were meant to be empty for a reason. Something ancient lives there, and it's always listening for new voices to collect. Dan Brenner disappeared from his Mojave Desert home on October 17, 2013. No body was ever found, but ham radio operators across the Southwest began reporting strange transmissions on impossible frequencies. A man giving detailed park ranger protocols, mixed with children's voices from different eras, all of them warning about something that lived in the spaces between stations. The warnings continue to this day, broadcast on frequencies that shouldn't exist, heard by those who tune their radios just slightly off the designated channels. The frequency children are still there, their numbers growing with each passing year. They sing their songs, recite their numbers, and cry their warnings into the electromagnetic void. And somewhere in the spaces between stations, the entity continues to feed, patient and eternal, converting human consciousness into signal one voice at a time. It doesn't need to hunt actively anymore. Curious ham radio operators, ghost hunters with spirit boxes, children playing with their parents' old radios, they all eventually find their way to those impossible frequencies. The spaces between stations are getting crowded, just as the note warned. The entity needs more room, more frequencies, more voices for its collection. Soon it won't be content with just the wilderness areas where reality is thin. Cities have their own electromagnetic anomalies, their own spaces between channels where something hungry could hide. Listen carefully to your radio during the next emergency broadcast test. In the silence between the alert tones, you might hear them, the frequency children, trying to warn you about what's coming. They've been broadcasting their message for decades, trapped in the spaces we were never meant to find. Their voice is the only proof that they ever existed at all. But whatever you do, don't try to answer them. Don't tune to the spaces between stations. And if you hear your own voice coming through the static, calling to you from a frequency that shouldn't exist, turn off the radio immediately. It might already be too late. The call came through on David Brennan's Motorola APX 8000 at 4:47 a.m., crackling with the particular static that plagued the Olympic National Park's northwestern sectors during heavy fog. 23 years of ranging had taught him to recognize the dispatcher's tension before she spoke. That slight intake of breath that meant another hiker had failed to check in. Ranger Brennan, we have an overdue party on the Ho River Trail. Single hiker, female, age approximately mid-30s. Name registered as Margaret Chen. Expected back yesterday evening. David sat up in his bunk at the Ho Rainforest station, already reaching for his gear. Outside, the temperate rainforest pressed against the windows like something alive, its Douglas firs and Sitka spruces disappearing into pre-dawn darkness. June in Olympic meant 18 hours of daylight, but sunrise was still an hour away. Last known position? He pulled on his uniform, fingers working the buttons with practiced efficiency. According to her backcountry permit, she was attempting the Blue Glacier route. Day hike only, no overnight gear registered. David frowned. The Blue Glacier Trail stretched 17 miles one way, a challenging full-day trek even for experienced hikers. Most people attempting it solo carried emergency overnight supplies, permit or not. Weather conditions? Clear yesterday, fog rolled in around midnight. Current visibility at Ho Station is approximately 30 meters. He strapped on his search pack, a modified Osprey ether containing rope, first aid, emergency shelter, and enough supplies for 72 hours. His Garmin GPS map 66i showed full battery, satellite lock strong despite the weather. The fog would complicate aerial search, making ground reconnaissance essential. I'll initiate hasty search pattern along the standard route. Send backup to establish base camp at the visitor center. Copy that, Ranger Brennan. Be advised, we have another issue. David paused, one hand on the door. Go ahead. Chen's emergency contact called in something unusual. She received a voicemail from Chen's phone at 11:43 p.m. last night. The message was unclear. Sending you the audio file now. His phone buzzed. David played the message through his earpiece, and his blood suddenly felt too thick for his veins. The recording lasted 12 seconds. It was Margaret Chen's voice, but wrong, high and breathy, like a child trying to form words with an adult's vocal cords. Behind her voice, something else whispered in a language that wasn't quite language, more like wind being forced through spaces that shouldn't exist. The path goes backward, Chen's altered voice said. I can see my 7th birthday. The trees are singing. They say I'm almost home. Then nothing but that underlying whisper, growing louder until the recording cut off. David stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats. In 23 years, he'd recovered bodies from crevasses, tracked lost children through storms, even investigated the occasional suicide. But he'd never heard anything like that voice, the way it seemed to speak from multiple ages simultaneously. He clicked his radio. Dispatch, I'm heading out. Send that audio to my tablet for analysis en route. The Ho River Trail began innocuously enough, a well-maintained path winding through cathedral groves of old-growth forest. David's headlamp carved a tunnel through the fog, illuminating sword ferns that stood shoulder-high and moss that draped from branches like ancient curtains. He moved at a steady pace, calling Chen's name every 100 meters, pausing to listen for response. His GPS tracked his progress. 1 mile, 2, 3. The fog grew denser as he climbed, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. At mile marker 4, he stopped. The trail split here, the main path continuing toward Blue Glacier, while a smaller track branched north. According to his digital maps, no official trail existed in that direction, yet the path was clearly worn, old enough that roots had been polished smooth by countless boots. David studied his GPS. The screen flickered, coordinates jumping wildly before stabilizing. The magnetic compass on his backup navigation spun lazily, unable to find north. He pulled out his phone to photograph the unmarked trail, but the camera app crashed repeatedly. He knelt, examining the ground with his flashlight. Fresh boot prints led down the unnamed path, a women's size 7 or 8 matching Chen's description. But underneath those prints were others, dozens of them, all heading the same direction. None returned. David marked the GPS waypoint manually and followed the prints. The unmarked trail descended into a valley that shouldn't exist. His topographical maps showed a gradual incline toward Glacier Meadows, but here the path dropped sharply, switchbacking through trees that grew progressively stranger. The Douglas firs gave way to something else, trunks that twisted in helical patterns, bark that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. The fog changed too. Instead of the uniform gray of marine layer, it moved in ribbons of varying density. Some patches so thick they looked solid, others clear as glass. Through one clear patch, David glimpsed something impossible. Stars, despite it being well past sunrise now. He checked his watch. 6:23 a.m. He checked again. 6:22 a.m. The second hand was moving backward. David stopped walking. His training covered medical emergencies, wilderness survival, even aggressive wildlife. But nothing in the Ranger Handbook addressed temporal anomalies. He forced himself to think clinically. Altimeter malfunction, magnetic interference, some kind of atmospheric phenomenon affecting his equipment. Then he heard the singing. It came from ahead, a child's voice raised in a nonsense rhyme. The words were English but arranged wrongly, like someone had learned the sounds but not the meaning. David recognized the vocal pattern immediately. It matched the strange quality of Chen's message. He found her 50 yards down the path, sitting cross-legged in a small clearing where the fog formed a perfect sphere of clarity. Margaret Chen, according to her hiking permit, was 34 years old. The person sitting before him looked perhaps 8, swimming in adult-sized hiking clothes that pooled around her diminished frame. Ms. Chen? David kept his voice calm, professional, despite the impossibility before him. She looked up with eyes that belonged to neither child nor adult, ancient and new simultaneously, as if multiple ages were superimposed on the same face. When she smiled, her teeth were a child's, too large for her shrunken gums. "The path remembers," she said in that horrible multiplied voice. "It remembers when the forest was young, when we were young, when we will be young." David took a step forward, and his boot aged through its life cycle in seconds. Leather cracking, sole separating, laces rotting to threads. He pulled his foot back and the boot reformed, though not quite as it had been. The toe was scuffed now where it had been pristine, the lacing pattern slightly different. "Margaret, I need you to come with me. Your family is worried." She laughed, a sound that started as an adult's chuckle and ended as an infant's gurgle. "I don't have a family yet. I won't meet my husband for 20 years. My daughter won't be born until I'm older, but she was here. She was 6 and scared, and the trees sang her younger and younger until she wasn't." David's radio crackled with static that resolved into voices, dozens of them all calling for help in progressively younger tones until they became crying, then silence. "How many others?" he asked. Margaret held up her hands, counting on fingers that grew smaller as he watched. "Everyone who finds the path. It's been here since before the park, before the country, before humans walked upright. The forest dreams of its youth, and the dream is a path, and the path leads backward. There has to be a way out. Out is forward, but the path only goes back." She stood, her adult clothes falling away from a body that was now perhaps 6 years old. "I can feel my memories leaving. College is gone, high school is fading. Soon I won't remember my name. Then I won't remember words. Then I won't remember." David reached for his emergency satellite beacon, but the device crumbled in his hand, aging backward through its manufacturing process until it was raw plastic and metal ore. His GPS did the same, then his radio, his equipment disappearing into its component history. The fog was closing in, but not fog. Time itself, thick and viscous, flowing backward like a river reversing course. David could feel it pulling at him, his cells remembering their younger configurations. His joints loosened, old scars fading, the gray at his temples darkening. Margaret was 4 now, maybe 3, her eyes losing their impossible depth as her brain simplified, neural pathways unforming. She tried to speak but only managed babbling sounds. David turned to run, but the path behind him was gone. Where he had entered the clearing, there was only more forest, trees that had never been cut, paths that had never been worn. His 23 years of ranger experience began to fade, procedures unlearning themselves, knowledge dissolving like sugar in rain. He pulled out his phone with fingers that were already younger, steadier. 1 bar of signal, impossible but there. He opened the voice recorder as Margaret made sounds that weren't quite crying anymore, closer to the reflexive noises newborns make. "This is Ranger David Brennan," he said, hearing his voice crack and rise. "June 15th, 2022, approximately 6 miles north of the Ho River Trail. There's an unmarked path. Don't follow it. The trail goes backward. It takes you backward. Everyone who..." His vocabulary simplified mid-sentence. Complex words became unavailable, locked away in parts of his brain that hadn't developed yet. He was 17, 15, 12. "The trees make you young," he managed, his voice a child's now. "They sing and you get small. Margaret is..." He looked at the infant on the ground, still shrinking, features softening toward the universal appearance of the unborn. Horror flooded through him, but it was a child's horror now, simple and overwhelming without the complex frameworks adults use to process fear. "Mommy," he said, the word coming unbidden. 9 years old, 8, the phone huge in his small hands. "I want Mommy." The recording continued as David's vocabulary disappeared entirely. Crying gave way to younger sounds, prehistoric vocalizations from humanity's infant stage. The phone fell from fingers that could no longer grip, landing beside what had been Margaret Chen and was now only potential, cells undifferentiating, returning to the primitive state before life chose its path. In the Ho Visitor Center, Ranger Patricia Williams played the recovered recording for the search and rescue team. David Brennan had been missing for 3 days now, vanished while searching for Margaret Chen. His final transmission was barely intelligible, the voice of a very young child fading to something even younger. "Should we send another team?" someone asked. Patricia looked at the map, at the coordinates David had managed to send before his equipment failed. Satellite imagery showed nothing but unbroken forest canopy, no trail where he'd marked one. "We follow established protocols," she said. "Grid search pattern, but no one goes alone, and no one investigates any unmarked paths." But that night she dreamed of singing trees and paths that led backward, and when she woke, she was certain she could hear children crying in the forest, hundreds of them, thousands, all the souls who had found the retrograde path and followed it back to before they began. The search was called off after 2 weeks. David Brennan and Margaret Chen were listed as missing, presumed dead. The Park Service updated their maps, adding warnings about magnetic anomalies in the northwestern sector. They installed new signs at the 4-mile marker. "Danger, unstable terrain, do not leave designated trail." But hikers still report strange things in that part of the forest. Singing that sounds like children's voices aging in reverse. Boot prints that seem to shrink as you follow them. And sometimes on foggy mornings when the veil between past and present grows thin, the sound of a baby crying somewhere in the trees. Not the cry of abandonment or hunger, but something worse. The sound of consciousness dissolving, awareness unbecoming, the terrible realization of returning to nothing, remembered by no one, having never truly been at all. The path is still there, though no map will ever show it. The forest remembers when it was young, before humans carved trails through its dreams. And sometimes it shares that memory with those who wander too far from the marked routes, pulling them backward through their own histories until they pass through birth, through conception, through the very possibility of existing. In the ranger station, Patricia Williams keeps David's last photo on the memorial wall. a man who served 23 years, who saved dozens of lives, who vanished investigating an impossible trail. But sometimes, when she looks at the photo, she swears his face looks younger than she remembers. The gray at his temples less pronounced, the lines around his eyes softer. She submitted requests to investigate the area with ground-penetrating radar, atmospheric monitoring equipment, even quantum field detectors borrowed from the University of Washington. All denied. The Park Service sees no reason to allocate resources to what they classify as a simple disappearance in difficult terrain. But Patricia has begun her own research. Old newspapers from before the park's establishment, native oral histories, pioneer journals. The pattern goes back centuries. People vanishing in that particular valley, always preceded by reports of strange singing, paths that shouldn't exist, time moving wrongly. The Ho tribe called it the path that swallows its own tail. Early settlers labeled it devil's regression. But the truth Patricia suspects is neither supernatural nor malevolent. The forest dreams, and in that specific place, its dreams bleed through into reality, a temporal anomaly, a wrinkle in space-time, a place where causality runs in reverse. She's planning her own expedition, alone, because she won't risk anyone else. She's 53 years old, 31 years of service, enough memories and experiences that maybe she can afford to lose a few years and still make it back with answers. The equipment she's gathering is all mechanical, no electronics to age backward into their components. Compass, paper maps, film camera, a rope anchored to a tree at the trail's entrance, something to follow back if the path itself disappears, and a journal to document what happens when human consciousness encounters time flowing backward. Her final entry before leaving, dated July 3, 2022. If I don't return, don't search for me. The path doesn't lead anywhere we can follow. It leads to before the beginning, to the place where stories end by never having started. David Brennan served honorably. Margaret Chen died doing what she loved. That's all anyone needs to know. But if you must know the truth, look for the children's voices in the fog. Listen for the singing that gets younger and younger, and understand that some paths lead not to death, but to unbirth, unbecoming, the dissolution of everything we were or might have been. The forest remembers when it was young, and it's lonely in its memories. Don't let it share them with you. Patricia Williams was reported missing on July 5, 2022. Her anchored rope was found severed cleanly, the end aged to brittleness. Her journal was recovered nearby, but the pages were blank, not erased, but never written on, the ink having aged backward to its liquid state and beyond, the thoughts that drove the pen having retreated into the unthinking past. The Park Service has officially closed the northwestern sector to public access, citing unstable geological conditions. But on quiet nights, rangers at the Ho station report hearing something impossible. A newborn crying in the forest with Patricia Williams's voice, calling for help in a language that predates words. A sound that grows younger and quieter until it's indistinguishable from wind through the trees. The retrograde path remains patient and eternal, a wound in time where the forest's memory overrides the forward flow of existence. It waits for the next curious hiker, the next dedicated ranger, the next soul to discover that some trails lead not to destinations, but to origins, and that returning to the beginning means ceasing to have ever been at all. In the visitor center, they've stopped putting photos on the memorial wall. The images keep changing, the faces growing younger each time someone looks, until eventually there's nothing but empty frames holding pictures of people who haven't been born yet, who will never be born, who were unmade by a path that remembers when nothing had begun. The warning signs multiply each season, but they too age backward, the words fading to simpler language, then pictographs, then blank wood that remembers when it was still part of a living tree. The forest is reclaiming not just the land, but the very concept of human intrusion, one reversed life at a time. And somewhere in that impossible valley where time flows like water running uphill, David Brennan is still walking backward through his own existence, his consciousness fragmenting into younger and younger states, his last coherent thought a child's simple wish. To go home, not knowing that home is a concept that requires a future, and the path only leads to the past, before home was possible, before thought was possible, before the universe decided that David Brennan should exist at all.